morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those who are watching from Europe. I am extremely pleased to welcome you to the 36th Conference of Central Banks and Official Institutions of the Latin American Reserve Fund. The feeling of personal and institutional satisfaction has basically three main sources. In the first place, it is an honor to see that institutions and people of such a prominent level are here with us to explore and suggest alternatives on the topics of the agenda we have arranged. This group of panelists with ample experience and deep knowledge will undoubtedly allow us to discuss options and more clearly and accurately visualize what we may expect for the coming years. Without a doubt, with their academic and professional experience, they have accepted and welcomed randomness in all its forms, as pointed out by Nassim Taleb. This is the path to improve our response to adversity and change, and thus reduce the fragility and the impacts of circumstances that may be associated to the black swan metaphor. I will now say that we may consider that facing one of these adversities, the COVID pandemic, from which we are still learning, led us not only to be gathered today in the historic city of Cartagena, but also to be simultaneously connected with several countries around the world, which just a couple of years ago was almost unthinkable. I extend a warm and heartfelt greetings to the hundreds of people that connected through our communication channels who will be accompanying us in an ongoing dialogue during this day. Second, we feel challenges. Undoubtedly, we must harness this opportunity to use all our capabilities to deliver in search for the best alternatives for central bank management and for the management of public portfolios in general. The idea is to ensure that these decisions are not evaluated only by way of numerical or financial exercises, but that they can contribute to ensure the greatest well-being in our societies, in a future full of economic, political, and social challenges. This forum of analysis and critical thinking among experts will most certainly increase the ability to identify and understand these complex scenarios. I believe that tomorrow we will be able to say that we are stronger and better prepared to face the challenges that lie ahead. In closing, I want to convey my feelings of gratitude. I start with the FLAR team, which has been working for months in preparing a conference that contributes to our institutional strategy toward becoming increasingly relevant, updated, and regional. The companies and institutions found in the program allow us to ratify FLAR's comprehensive role and contribution of this broad and critical community, and how his actions are valued in Latin America. Likewise, it's gratifying to confirm that crucial conversations on regional financial stability are followed with interest by major players on the world stage. I want to thank all panelists for your dedication and generosity in being part of this event. Welcome to Cartagena. Welcome to this seminar. I anticipate the best of success in our deliberation. I now yield the floor to Iker Zubizarreta, who will share his comments on the content of the seminar and the purpose we seek. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Many thanks for your very kind and inspiring words, Dr. Uribe, and many thanks for all of you to be here with us today. Yesterday I was talking to a friend, Marcelo, and he said to me, Iker, the last time that I was here was before the pandemic, November 2019, And then the first time that I go out to an event is again here in Cartagena with you. So he says, I cannot begin to tell you how excited and happy I am to be here today. And my answer to that is, I think I do know, and I think that we all know how exciting it is to be here and how happy we are to be here today in the flesh after 3 years. Another personal related experience at this respect, also 2 days ago, some friends, we went to a bar here at Alquímico in Cartagena, and we were there, loud music, lots of people, no mask, chatting, eating, having a good time. And then a part of me inside went, you know, it was obvious that at some point we would be back here in the flesh, life would be normal, and we would resume. And then immediately another part of me went, that wasn't obvious at all. I mean, say winter 2020, those were some pretty dark and frightening times. No clear way to a vaccination, mass inoculation, and what have you. So it wasn't obvious at all. Many people, friends and relatives, were left behind. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. God bless them and their families. But here we are, and resuming life as not only as we know it. I think in many senses it's even better in several dimensions. A final sort of personal thought that I wanted to share with you. Also, 1 year ago, November 2021, we were at FLAR in our own internal budgeting process. And we came to the discussion, okay, Cartagena conference, what are we going to do? I mean, we were still working from home, and we said, you know what? We think that a year from now, we will be able to have at least a footprint in Cartagena. Some people will dare to come. And so we acted accordingly. You know, came March, it came the time when we had to make reservations and so on, and we were really bold. We said, we are going to book 20 rooms at the Santa Teresa. And that sounded like, oh my God, what about if, you know, nobody comes, and what, are you gonna pay for that and all? Well, fast forward, there are 53 of us here today. And all along the way, we had to scramble for rooms and reservations and so on, and then being here with you in this occasion is just, you know, reflecting on Marcelo's word. I cannot tell you how happy I am to be here with you today, and how grateful we are that you are with us here today, making time in your busy schedules. Also, to our remote audience, many thanks for making the time to accompany us today. So, switching a bit, and since we are talking history, well, I am talking history. This that you see in the screen is a certificate of me, Iker Zubizarreta, participating in 1991 in this, I think it was the 5th or the 6th edition of the conference. So this is the 36th. So this white hair is no fake. You know, I've been around. This is 31 years plus. And then at this point in time, we are also adjusting internally in FLAR. We are doing some remodeling of our offices. And I was going through a whole bunch of boxes of things that I didn't even know were there. And I came up with a good number of our past agendas. And in all of these agendas, if we fast forward, one overcoming theme is that we have always been in a crisis. There has always been disruption, you know, uncertainty. If you see the titles, I've been here at FLAR since 2005, and I said, well, it doesn't seem like we are very original. But this brings me to the point that we are always in some kind of crisis. We certainly live in uncertainty. That's the only thing that is certain. And we find a way always. We get taken to the ground, and then we get up and keep going. And then we get punched and fall back, and then we get up again, and that's how it goes. But there is one thing that we do not reflect in this element, is that we not only fall and get up, but we get up and we are wiser, we are stronger, we are better. And an example of that is what we are doing today. 2019, only the people that would be in this room would be on stage or participating in the sessions. Now we have a live audience, and we are not only having experts connecting from places as far as Asia and Europe, as well as the US and other parts, but we are also broadcasting this event along the whole Latin American region and beyond. That is the concept of resilience 2.0 or anti-fragility. We are stronger, we are wiser, we are better. We learn from what we encounter, we move on and then get better and better as we face all these challenges. So with that, that's the theme of our conference this year, anti-fragility 2.0. So talking a bit about the agenda, we started the last 2 weeks. We had some remote sessions. We had Jan Hatzius, Arnav, well, it will come back. Some other experts. And then today, we will be having this hybrid component of the conference. And in this composition, what we said, okay, the morning, we're going to be talking about the state of the planet, where we are. We'll be talking about economics, geopolitics, geoeconomics, and many issues, where we are, extremely challenging times, as we know. And then in the afternoon, we will be talking about the future. And the theme is the future is now. The future has arrived. What am I talking about at this respect? The last 3, 4, 5 years, we have been talking about many disruptive technologies and trends. And along the way, some of my friends and colleagues would come and say, Iker, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about blockchain and AI and what have you? That is going to happen eventually some 30, 40, 50 years ago. And then what we are seeing is that it didn't take 3, 4, 5 decades. It took 3, 4, 5 years. And what we're going to be seeing is several leading institutions in our scope that will be showing us how they have been adapting and implementing all these technologies in their own day-to-day and their companies. And then finally, in the closing segment, I will be talking with Jim Reynolds and Stella Lupushore on the future of work and diversity. One thing to comment, it's we will be giving books on, this is Stella's, I'm sure that she'll be more than happy to sign, and this is Marco's book. They will be behind. If you prefer to have them on digital format, we can do that. And for those of you that are remotely, we will be also giving away some of these books in each of the sessions. So make sure to stay connected throughout the day. So that's what I have for you at this point in time. Once again, many thanks. And remember that friend I told you about, Marcelo? Well, guess what? He will be leading the next section. So Marcelo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Iker. It really is a pleasure to be back here. It was let's say the last memory before the pandemic started was coming here, and it's the first one after the pandemic. So it's a really pleasure to be back here, and it's a pleasure to have this talk with Marko. I think most of the room here is people from emerging markets, and market analysis and political analysis for people in emerging markets is something that's been it's a constant for us for years, and it's probably a new thing for developed markets. And Marko is one of the key people now doing political analysis for markets, and it's a real pleasure to meet you in person, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marcelo, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. So, the title of my talk is that, what if the world is not ending? There's so much bearishness about geopolitics and politics, and for good reason. I'm not sure if, Iker, when you attended your seminar in 1991, there was anybody talking about geopolitics. And if there was, it was all positive in 1991. Except for a few corners of the world, including where I'm originally from in Yugoslavia, most of the things happening in 1991 were going in the right direction. I want to talk about today and why I don't think that what's happening today is that new, and why I think that what's happening today is not that negative either. But before I do that, I want to talk about three things. Before I get into the slides, I want to talk about three things that I think really matter for central banks and for institutions such as yours. First of all, geopolitics is not transitory, Neither is inflation, but geopolitics is not going to be transitory. Not in the world we have today. And that's for three reasons. We have three challenges globally that I think are going to dominate the rest of this decade. The first is a transition from the Washington consensus to what I named the Buenos Aires consensus. Now, if anyone's here from actually Buenos Aires, I apologize. I needed something that would punch Americans in the face, And nothing punches them in the face better than telling them the world is going to be more like Argentina. Now, I didn't mean it in a bad way. I'm from Serbia, believe me. Argentinian inflation to us is a joke, You cannot express the inflation I lived through in a simple number. It's like 10 to the power of a number. So, what does that mean, the transition from Washington consensus to Buenos Aires consensus? What it means is that the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher revolution, the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher revolution gave us a set of best practices. Laissez-faire capitalist system, pro-cyclical, counter-cyclical fiscal policy, orthodox monetary policy, free trade, deregulation, privatization. Those were the best practices established in the 80s. And they were then promoted, as many of you know, very well and personally, by the institutions from Washington, D.C. That's your Washington consensus. That's going in reverse now. And it's not just going in reverse in Beijing because Xi Jinping is focusing on common prosperity. It's going in reverse everywhere. In the United Kingdom, in the US, everywhere else. It's moving somewhere else. That's not going to be reversed because Jay Powell wants to raise rates. In fact, the biggest constraint to orthodox monetary policy will be that the median voter across the world does not want austerity, does not want pain. What's interesting to me about the United Kingdom, by the way, is this is playing out in real time. Don't forget, Liz Truss won the election. When it came to Sunak versus Truss, she won. She won with a populist, non-traditional, like let's cut taxes, who cares about debt, YOLO economic policy. Sunak lost. Now, that wasn't a true election. It was an election in front of Tory members of the party. But the fact is, she won. And so I don't think that Sunak is going to show up and suddenly do austerity. Like, that's not happening. This isn't David Cameron. He doesn't have the political mandate for pain. We're going to need more years of suboptimal economic outcomes before the political side of the world turns towards what you consider orthodox policies. That's the first thing. The second thing is global multipolarity. We're not in a unipolar or a bipolar world anymore. As I'm going to talk about today, we're in a multipolar world. Multipolar world is also inefficient. Globalization is still going to exist, but it will be less efficient. Countries will deploy resources to have just-in-case inventories, not just-in-time. That's also inflationary, just like populism is. And the final big picture is climate change. The fight against that is also going to create inefficiencies. What I'm describing here are basically three thrusts that have nothing to do with demand. They have nothing to do with interest rates. They have to do with the fact that our supply globally is being affected by long trends. And central banks are going to be challenged in this environment because merely raising or lowering interest rates is not going to be enough. It's maybe not going to do anything to solve the supply problems that we've created due to populism, due to global multipolarity, and due to the fight against climate change that's going to create massive inefficiencies in energy markets. So how do you deal with this as central banks? What do you have to do? Well, I think the number one thing is staffing, which is funny because we're going to have a whole, other panel on that. But it's not going to be as simple as just hiring a bunch of guys with CFAs. Let me put it that way. I know the CFA curriculum. There's nothing about politics in there. There's nothing about the median voter. There's nothing about anything we're going to talk about today. You're going to have diversity of thought. That's the number one thing that's going to be actually needed. And I swear I did not talk to Stella before this. I swear. I introduced myself, I said some nice things, but I think that's the number one thing. But it's also important to understand that to do this job, to do geopolitical or political analysis that's relevant for markets, you can't just hire some ex-policymaker, no offense to the next panel, but you wouldn't hire an ex-CEO to be your tech analyst. You're not going to hire an ex-CEO of a tech company to do tech sector analysis, would you? Why would you? You would hire some young tech analyst who understands how markets work. So what we actually need is we need to start thinking about politics and geopolitics not as a fireside chat conversation, not as something that past expiration date policymakers and bureaucrats come together to offer their advice for a very high consulting fee. No, it's an expertise that requires an actual framework. Now I have a framework, that's what the book is about. Is it useful? It's a starting point. It is what it is. Is it always right? Of course not. Am I wrong? All the time. But it's a starting point. And it doesn't include somebody sipping a scotch in a smoke-filled room and telling you what they did in 1973. All right, that's the important point. It's a framework that we can all use. So what I do is I focus on material constraints to policymakers. You want to predict the behavior of Vladimir Putin, President Xi, President Biden, whoever, you have to start with something that we can all analyze, the objective reality. Material constraints are what forces policymakers to go down the path of least resistance. Now, they don't always abide by these rules. I would argue President Putin said, to hell with your constraints, I'm going to go and invade Ukraine anyways. But once that happens, if you did the hard work of creating the material constraint framework, you can know how that war is going to end up. And in the case of Vladimir Putin, it's not going very well, because the material constraints to invading Ukraine were very obvious. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think are happening in the world through this perspective. And I hope that you will see how the framework kind of works in real time. And if you're interested, you can read the book. It's actually pretty short. And while it's a framework book, which means I'm a massive nerd, I did try to make it very funny. So there's a lot of funny anecdotes in there. All right, so let's get into the slides. What is the case that everybody presents today for why the world is, different and why it's falling apart? I would argue that the number one reason why you should be concerned about what the world looks like is that we are in a multipolar world. Now, in political science, this means something very important. There's three types of ordering of geopolitical power in the world. Oh, and by the way, just one thing. This is a very small crowd, so if anybody wants to say something, please raise your hands. Well, Marcelo,
the idea is to be very interactive. I think there's going to be a section at the end with questions, right, Iker? And but feel free to interrupt at any time, and I'll interrupt you during your.
Marcelo will interrupt too, so just throw something at me or yell. Okay, so what is the case for more instability in the world? It's very simple. In political science, when we think about the world of states, there's a very clear theory. You can have a unipolar world, which is the most stable. Okay, it's like having one bully in the schoolyard. As investors, we love that because there's a set of rules and norms of behavior that are imposed from the top. Now, as Latin Americans, you may not like it. You know, as a Serb, I may not like it. But it doesn't really matter because as an investor, it provides a set of rules and norms. It's an equilibrium. That's a unipolar world. That's the world run by America for the past 30 years. For most of us here in this room, that was the world that we have experienced and we've known. The second type of a world is a bipolar distribution of power. Now, bipolar distribution of power is the type of a world where you have two clear camps, right? Two clear camps. That is also actually a very simple world to model. And in fact, Cold War saw a rise of mathematical modeling in political science departments. That's where game theory really came into play. Why? Because it's simple. There's two actors. Nobody's really independent in a bipolar world. There's only two deciders. The third ordering of power is a multipolar world. A multipolar world is one where multiple countries pursue their foreign policy interests independent of one another. I truly believe we're in this world, and I've believed it for the last decade. Now, it was a controversial view 10 years ago, where most of people I spoke with still believed in American hegemony. It's a controversial view today because a lot of people in the institutional investment space thinking about long-term investing believe we're in a bipolar world again, US versus China. In fact, most of my clients are pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and they're asking me to fill out these Excel spreadsheets for them, where I put countries neatly into two columns, which I think is a stupid research request. So I tell them I'll just take a roll of dice and roll it and put countries into the two panels. The world is not bipolar, it's multipolar. Now, multipolarity is proven through political science theory and game theory to produce this. This is a chart of conflicts around the world. I didn't put this together. This is from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. It basically shows you the number of conflicts happening at any one point. And we're basically at the highest level of global conflict since the Second World War, which is exactly what political science theory would have predicted would happen. That seems scary, and I don't think that's going to come down in any meaningful way. It seems scary, but it isn't. Not every conflict is going to be macro relevant. Not every conflict will impact global supply and demand. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions today is that this fast-paced volatility of political news matters to you on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, take the war in Ukraine. From a market perspective, most of us were wrong. The impact on commodity markets was overstated and reflected the geopolitical risk premium that was unwarranted. Why? Think about it. Think about the outcome of the Ukraine war 6 months later. Did we actually lose any Russian barrels of oil from the marketplace? No, and I would argue we didn't because the EU oil embargo is a PR effort, not an actual effort to take Russian oil off the market. If the West wanted to sanction Russia, we would have used secondary sanctions, which we used against Iran, where you can go after buyers of Iranian crude in US courts. We literally didn't do that with Russia. And that's why the Indians are bathing themselves in Russian oil. In fact, what happened was you got the same amount of Russian barrels coming out of Russia at a discounted price. Who would have thought of that? So my point is that just because there's a lot of conflict doesn't mean that every conflict will be macro relevant. And in fact, this reflects previous moments in human history, such as late 19th century and early 20th century, where there was a plethora of conflicts around the world. Scramble for Africa between France, United Kingdom, and Germany. There was a plethora of conflicts, and yet the global economy remained globalized, trade continued, as did investment, even between enemies. Trade between the United Kingdom and Germany went through the roof right up until the end of the beginning of the World War I. So a multipolar environment is one that's volatile, it's got a lot of political conflict, but globalization, trade, and even investment between rivals continues. The second thing that I think is a source of a lot of concern is globalization. As you can see on this chart, this is a trade globalization proxy. So I'm using here, trade globalization is being measured as imports as percent of GDP weighed by population. What this chart shows is that when the delta is extremely steep, when trade globalization is increasing, it's usually underpinned by hegemony. So the British hegemony in the 19th century, American from 1980 to 2020, 2010. And by the way, I would argue that the oval showing the American hegemony is too long. It's really from 1980 that it begins, right when you see that inflection, right when bipolarity ends. We don't have this anymore. So the world is not going to have a clear hegemon providing rules and norms of behavior. And again, just to be clear, it doesn't have to be America. It can be China. It can be an alien life force that enslaves us. As long as they let us trade and invest, we as investors would be happy. The point is, we don't have that clarity. But we also don't have a bipolar world that will split the world neatly into two. We have a multipolar world. So some level of globalization will remain. And history proves this and shows that that's the case. Okay, so
Can I just ask a question on
Please.
that? So how do you shift from a trade point of view? How do you think it's good? Because you still are working under the old, let's say, the bipolar or the unipolar world rules as of now. So you're going to have to shift into from a trade point of view. How do you think that shift's going to take place?
So a lot of people have thought that we're going to have a disengagement between US and China, and that it's going to be very dramatic, right? There's going to be this disentanglement. And you're seeing that in certain sectors. For example, the most obvious one that's on the cover of FT is chips. But if you look at the macro variables, macro data does not reveal any shift. Macro data reveals that US trade deficit relative to China is growing, it's not shrinking. And it shows that, for example, European-China trade is now the largest trade in the world. So Europe and China now trade more as a bloc than any other bloc, US-Europe or US-China even. So I think that it's going to happen gradually. Just like China was brought into the center of global trade gradually, it didn't happen overnight. Basically, in the 90s, entry into WTO 2001, and then throughout to the 2000s. Similarly, moving China from the center of global trade to a little bit of the periphery is going to take a decade. And so I actually don't see this as a challenge. It's not a risk, it's an opportunity. The same trades, the same investments that worked when we brought China from the periphery to the middle, what were those? Jim O'Neill's BRICS piece in 2001, commodity supercycle, the capex-led cycle. What did you need to bring China from the periphery to the middle? You needed copper, you needed Caterpillar, and you needed steel, and you needed energy. Doing the reverse, taking China from the middle to the periphery, will require copper, will require Caterpillar, and will require steel and energy. In other words, if you're sitting in Latin America, like you're in 2002 right now, you're 2003, and you know, I don't have to say anything else. You're already starting to think about remodeling your house and buying maybe a second or a third car. You know what I mean? We are at a precipice of a very similar cycle to the early 2000s. And it doesn't matter that we're going to have slightly less globalization because of it. It's almost irrelevant. The investment thesis is exactly the same. So what I would do is I would load up on commodities and capex. That would be my answer to, how does this happen? It happens gradually, and it's actually a positive investment thesis. Now, of course, I'll be wrong if the Cold War happens. If Cold War happens, then this is completely different. Globalization will collapse. We will go into a purely bifurcated world. Now, here's why I think Cold War is a lazy analogy. It's a lazy analogy for a lot of reasons. First of all, most geopolitical analysts and investors only know two mental maps. We only have two mental images in our head: American hegemony and Cold War. That's all we have to rely on ourselves. None of us have ever been alive during a multipolar world. So we think, well, of course, US and China are going to split the world into two parts. That's not going to happen. And like you're here in Latin America, I'm sure that you're thinking like this already. But for most Americans, it's inconceivable that there can be a multipolar world. Before I go into some of my own thoughts, let me just give you a historical kind of perspective. 1945 is not going to repeat itself. 1945 was a unique moment in history. There were two nuclear devices exploded over Japan. China would have a civil war for another 7 years. India was a colony, the most populous country in the world, second most populous country in the world at the time, was a colony of a tired empire that was bankrupt. And Europe was decimated. And there was tens of millions of starving refugees roaming through collapsed continent. So 1945, there were only two countries with any relevance. And they locked the world into this incredible moment of bipolarity. That's not going to happen today. Are America and China the most powerful countries in the world? Sure. Is the rest of the world decimated? Hell no. Not even close. And by the way, that's what you need for bipolarity. Bipolarity is like two bullies in a schoolyard. They put a little chalk line down the middle, and then not only do they hit each other, but they make sure no one's fighting. So if there's a fight that breaks up over there, the two bullies come and they pop the other kids. Good example is the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis, 1950s. France, United Kingdom, and Israel decide to take the Sinai from Egypt. They're like, oh, we can do this. We're nuclear powers, right? And America says, we have a deal with the Soviets. You're going to get out of Egypt. United Kingdom says, we're an empire. We have nukes. You can't tell us what to do. And the US said, okay, cool story, bro. I'm going to collapse the pound. Get out of Egypt right now. Today, America can't tell Turkey what to do. You know what I mean? This is the world we live in today. It's a multipolar world. Now, the best way to visualize this for you is this map. Okay, this is kind of a funny map. I chose one issue. You might not like the issue, but it is what it is. This is a map of countries that have banned Huawei for 5G development. So what it shows is the number of countries that have banned Huawei. That's in black. You have the US, you have Australia, which always does what US does for a number of reasons. You have Canada. I'm Canadian, basically. Canada is America's hat. You have some countries in the middle of Europe nobody cares about. You have Sweden. I'm sure Sweden banned Huawei for national security reasons. It has nothing to do with the fact that they, have Ericsson. United Kingdom. That's it. This is the coalition of the willing that America has produced against Huawei. It is a very pathetic effort after 6 years. And this reflects that multipolar nature of the world we're in. It's going to be very difficult to produce coalitions of the willing in a multipolar world. Now, if the Chinese do something stupid, like invade Taiwan, it will be easy. But China itself, in my view, is constrained by a number of factors, starting with the fact that China is experiencing the kind of secular end to their debt supercycle that the West did after 2008. So if you look at the chart on the left, this is a very important chart for China. It's household debt as percent of disposable income. The purple line is China. Chinese middle class story is basically over. They're overly indebted. Their C in the GDP equation is not going to drive growth, no matter what they want. You guys remember dual circulation? They talked about dual circulation a lot in China. It was basically an effort to boost their domestic production. Yeah, it's banned. You're not allowed to bring that term up anymore in China. Dual circulation is done. They're addicted to exports and will remain addicted to exports and investment for a long time. That's what the chart on the right shows. Why is this important? It's important because China's not Russia. China's not Iran. China's not Iraq. China's not producing energy, It's not exporting commodities. It's exporting toys, t-shirts, and toaster ovens. Things that the rest of the world can and will embargo. China understands this, which is why I expect China to go on a charm offensive over the next several years. Already has happened. They've already toned down their aggression when it comes to South China Sea, when it comes to Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries. This isn't reported in the Western press because it's unpalatable. China's crazy. China's aggressive. But if you actually look at Chinese behavior when it comes to Southeast Asia, when was the last time you talked about South China Sea with somebody? Probably 2016-17. I know because I've been writing about South China Sea all my career, and it was one of the first evidence that China was becoming more assertive. China's become a lot less assertive when it comes to this region. They don't want to anger their potential trade partners because they understand the only engine of growth for China is going to be external, not internal. In addition to that, I think they're going to have to boost investment. Now, that's something that Xi Jinping does not want to do. If I had to classify the current regime in China, I would say it's very Austrian, like from an economic perspective. They don't want to stimulate, but they will have to because domestic growth is going to continue to be impaired. Zero COVID policy is not why consumption in China is low. Chinese consumption is low because of this indebtedness. And that's a critical constraint on Chinese geopolitical power going forward. So invading Taiwan would be a really, really big mistake by China because it would lock them in and basically block them off from their only source of growth, which is external demand. Now, another thing that I think in the US and in the West we overemphasize is the China-Russia alliance. I don't think there is any China-Russia alliance. It's a figment of American propaganda. But God bless America. It has propaganda like any other country. I'm not being mean to the US, obviously. We all have propagandas. Russia and China relationship is as small as China's relationship with the Netherlands. Let me say that again. Russia is as relevant to China as the Netherlands. There is no infrastructural connections between China and Russia. ESPO pipeline, Power of Siberia 1, that is it. Now there's this Power of Siberia 2, which American policymakers obsess about. It would bring about 50 BCM from the Yamal cluster. Yamal Peninsula is where all the gas that goes to Europe is produced. It's in the European Arctic. Power of Siberia 2 is never going to be built, It's never going to be built. It will cost $300 billion. It will take years to design. You might as well build a staircase to the moon. It's never going to be built, I guarantee you. The Russians are just going to do what everybody else is going to do. They're going to build LNG export facilities. And those LNG cargoes, by the way, are going to go to Europe, which is the irony of this whole thing. But my point about this is that there's a reason Vladimir Putin is going to Iran to buy drones. There's a reason that the Russians are buying artillery from North Korea. And the reason is that the Chinese are not stupid. Chinese have not sold a single piece of military hardware to Russia because they don't need Russia. And the connections between the two are paltry. They need Europe. They need Europe to remain neutral. They need the map of Huawei 5G to remain as stupid as it looks. They need global multipolarity to continue. So expect a charm offensive in Europe from China especially. And by the way, Olaf Scholz is going to China. BMW is buying EVs from China. Europe is looking at this US-China rivalry and saying like, cool, if you want to lose money by sanctioning China, go ahead. We'll keep selling them Airbuses. We'll keep selling them technology. And an interesting test to my thesis will be what will ASML do over the next 12 and 18 months? What will Tokyo Electron do? What will Samsung do? Because what the US is telling the rest of the world is we're going to give illegal state aid, according to WTO, to our own semiconductor industry, but you can't make money off of China. Okay, I'm going to guess that's not going to work. And the first company that cheats, you want to sell everything you own and buy that company, by the way. The first company that cheats, that says to Americans, no, we're good, we're going to keep selling to China, That's going to be a company that captures massive market share in advanced semiconductors sales to China. Now, Ukraine war. Another part of the world. So I don't think Cold War is happening. I think it's a very dynamic environment where we have to remain on our toes. The second is Ukraine-Russia. I actually have a view that also I think is controversial. I think that the war has reached some form of an equilibrium. Now, this will be tested next 4 to 6 weeks. There's still a chance for Ukrainian offensive to prove this view wrong. There's about 4 to 6 weeks before we get into winter. And so if Ukrainian offensive continues to be very aggressive and successful, then I do think that there could be a chance for massive escalation by the Russians. The closer the Ukrainians get to Crimea, the more the Russians are going to be concerned. Now, if you look at this map, it's a little bit outdated. It's outdated by, let's say, 2 weeks. But what it shows is that Ukrainian offensive has been the most successful in the part of Ukraine that the Russians cared the least about, which is Kharkiv. This purple, like whatever's purple is basically what the Ukrainians reconquered since the summer. Obviously, I'm not showing all of the parts of Ukraine that were reconquered back in March when the Russians withdrew on March 25th. Now, there's 3 things that I think Russians want from Ukraine. Well, first of all, the overarching thing Russians want from Ukraine is nothing that you've heard in the press. It's not to keep NATO out of Ukraine. That's bullshit. The Germans already guaranteed Ukraine wouldn't be in NATO. It's not to recreate the Soviet Union. In my view, it's petty. Putin just wants to export domestic political angst abroad. That's it. That's what this war is about. Yeah, it's that simple. Nothing else. And we can do the Q&A. You can test me on this thesis. I have a very high conviction view that's the case. But okay, fine. There are some things they want out of Ukraine. What are those 3 things? 1, they want the land bridge to Crimea. Okay, that's Zaporizhia. They want Kherson for the water supply, and they want Donetsk and Luhansk. Kharkiv was least relevant to that goal, so they defended it the least. Also, the Ukrainians were very smart. They pretended like they were going to invade in the south. The Russians didn't really reinforce Kharkiv. But if you look at the Ukrainian offensive in the rest of Ukraine, it's a lot less, successful. And that's important because I think we're reaching a point that many wars reach, which is an equilibrium, when the 2 sides are exhausted. Most conflicts don't end in complete capitulation. That's our, we always anchor ourselves to World War II, World War I. That's not how wars end. Wars end when the 2 sides exhaust themselves, when you have a line of control. The Korean War is a good example. It never ended. The Korean War is still going on. Nobody accepted the territorial distribution of Korean Peninsula. It just ended after exhaustion. Cypriot conflict. Literally, Cyprus is still divided along the line of control. The Bosnian Civil War did not end in complete capitulation. I think we're getting to a point where that's going to happen here. And you're going to ask me, obviously, the question every client asks me, but will the Ukrainians accept that? And my answer is, I don't really care, It's irrelevant for the purposes of our analysis. No, they won't accept it. So what? My home country of Serbia hasn't accepted Kosovo's independence. It is what it is, Moldova did not accept that Transnistria is not theirs. It is what it is. From the market's perspective, this war is already over. From the market's perspective, this war is already over, and that's because the market is a brutal discounting mechanism, brutal, inhumane. It doesn't care about civilians being killed. It doesn't care about magical Putin's, fantastical mobilizations that won't do anything. The market needs ever-increasing objective measure of risk to discount. So this is a diagram of how I perceive we as market participants have to think about geopolitics. The objective measure of geopolitical risk is the purple line. It's a capital G. That's the objective reality. That's what you're reading in Financial Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. As you can see, the risk in Ukraine peaked sometimes in March when the Russians basically decided to quit their plan to conquer all of Ukraine, which was stupid to begin with. I cannot tell you how idiotic it was. We can discuss that later. And then the war has settled into some level of geopolitical risk that I think objectively is still elevated. Like people are still dying. There's still a war. but the market doesn't care. The geopolitical risk premium is a second derivative. It requires an ever-increasing objective measure of risk. How do I know this for a fact? Well, these two charts. On the right-hand side is commodities. Commodities have collapsed. You know, commodities have collapsed this year. And once I realized personally that the EU oil embargo is a joke, is a PR effort to make Macron and Schultz look good in newspapers, I shorted oil. That was my number one conviction view this year. The other one is on the left side. This is a hilarious chart. This is literally just comical right now. Putin announces mobilization, S&P 500 futures dip, go back up, and then Jay Powell has a press conference and it collapses the market. Jay Powell has more power over the market than Vladimir Putin. I would go as far as to say that Putin could use a tactical nuke, and if Jay Powell announces a pivot, the market will literally go up that day. That is how important what's happening on monetary side is relative to Ukraine. So there are limits to how long this war can go on, and they're constrained by a lot of things. Russian incompetence, Russian domestic politics, and this is a really important chart. This is getting worse and worse. This is Russia's assessment of the situation in the country. So Russian polling by Levada Center. It's going to keep looking bad, and this is a poll showing how long Russians thought the war was going to last. Most Russians thought the war was going to last less than a year, because that's what they were told. So, you know, a lot of people tell me, Marko, I have Russian friends, I speak to Russian family members, they tell me everyone's pro-Putin. Like, okay, cool. You know, everyone was pro-Putin in March and April and May. Let's see what happens in early 2023. Look, I can tell you what happened in my country. In 1999, when NATO started bombing Belgrade, liberals who hated Milosevic took their kids and printed little targets, and took those targets and took them to critical infrastructure in Belgrade. People took their kids to bridges and said, bomb me, to NATO. People who protested against Milosevic. At a moment when the war starts, patriotism is high. This is normal. It's like that in every country. 12 months later, there's a revolution in Serbia, you know? So I don't think that this is going to last. Russia has massive political risk if the war continues. I think we're at near the end. The final thing that I want to talk about that is my pet peeve right now, and is my highest conviction view probably, is this ridiculous argument that Europe is going to deindustrialize. Because natural gas prices have spiked, somehow Europe is going to, you know, stop having industry. So this is a chart of natural gas prices. This is December 2022 futures. I can't update my chart pack fast enough for how much these prices are falling. These prices are falling like a brick every single week. Why? Because they were driven by hysteria. This idea that, like, you know, Europe can't find gas. Now, there's a couple of things that happened for why Europe was able to fill storage. First and foremost, Putin is not a genius. Okay? If he was, he would have cut off Europe's gas in March. He didn't. He cut off gas in July. Why did he wait? I don't know. Second, he does not have as good of a macroeconomic team in China as we do. So he didn't realize China was going to slow down and make a lot of LNG cargoes available. By the way, Japan is about to restart its nuclear power plants, which will make another 12 BCM of LNG available to Europe, which is about 10% of this year's purchases. So there's constantly new LNG coming on the market, including because of slowdown in global growth. So Europe was able to purchase LNG, yeah, at high prices. And so everybody's saying, Marko, this is unsustainable. Europe cannot keep paying at these prices. Why? Why not? Putin has gas, Europe has. What's that sound? Ah, the sound of the printing press. So what did Europe do? 200 billion, 600 billion euros, who cares? How much was the bailout of Hippo Real Estate in 2010? Anybody remember? How much did Europe, Germany, pay to bail out one bank in 2010? No? 110 billion euros. So what's 200 billion to subsidize natural gas? Now you might say, well, Marko, subsidizing energy is not smart, right? Depends. Long term, wrong. If you're playing a game of chicken against Russia, all Europe needs to tell Putin is we will print money long enough that you can stay without your $50 billion a year from natural gas. My view, if the view on Ukraine is right, 6 months from now, he's begging the Germans to take the gas back. Begging them. And no, that he doesn't need Nord Stream. Nord Stream didn't add any capacity to Russia's ability to export natural gas. Nord Stream simply allowed Putin to send gas to Europe without crossing the borders of two countries that hate Russia the most, Ukraine and Poland. So not only is Putin going to beg Europe to take their gas in 6 months, he's going to have to do it through Ukraine and Poland. So that's the reason number one, this was hysterical. The reason number two is obviously there's a wall of LNG coming online. Wall. There is a tsunami of LNG coming online over the next 2 to 3 years, including Russia itself, which is going to have 50 BCM of LNG. By the way, first cargo they went this year went to Greece. The Russians sent their first LNG cargo this year to Europe, which tells you how ridiculous a lot of this stuff is. And the problem with this is that it's going to increase domestic gas prices in the US, not in Europe. So over the long term, domestic natural gas prices will rise in the US as US starts participating in the global LNG market. So it's not Europe that's going to have a problem in the long term in terms of higher energy prices, it will be US. Now, and this is important, Europe has never maintained its trade market share because of input costs. The chart on the left shows you electricity price for industrial users, US versus Europe. Europe has been paying higher electricity prices for decades. And yet, Germany, the gray line, the orange line is US, the gray line is Germany. Germany has defended its export market share, and so has France, by the way, since 2010, despite higher electricity prices. So when you hear this analysis that Europe is screwed because gas prices are higher, put it in historical perspective. Europe has had higher energy prices for the 2 decades. What am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that the market has overpriced risks emanating from this crisis. The euro has basically collapsed. Now this is a chart of euro and natural gas prices. So actually no, this is euro and US and Germany 10-year real yields. So euro has disconnected from real yield, relative real yields. The euro has disconnected from natural gas prices, and the euro has disconnected from the OIS curve implied tightening over the next 12 months. In other words, the euro, I think, is a buy at these levels, which obviously tells you what my view on the DXY is as well, because it's just the euro. The second is European industrials, which are probably the best investment opportunity for the long term right now. They have absolutely lost all value because of this hysteria. In the long term, Europe is going to overcome these issues. In fact, the crisis itself may spur more innovation in Europe. Europe actually has primary energy consumption, 30% is renewables, and this energy crisis will spur more technological innovation in a part of the world that's already pretty good when it comes to industrials. Yes, Arnab, you have a question.
Yeah, just on the currency question, I just wonder if this is primarily about the real yield differential or monetary policy and not about the terms of trade shock. As you said yourself, right, yeah. Europe is going to have to pay a lot more for energy, even if there's plenty of it available, and especially if this stretches on towards next winter, and the US is a beneficiary of that terms of trade shock, right?
So I get the question a lot, and I would argue that that's why the euro is at parity. That terms of trade shock has already been priced in by the currency. And I think going forward, it will be less and less. In other words, over the next 12 months, natural gas prices will continue to come down, and European, all the other indicators, whether it's relative real yields, whether it's relative monetary policy, whether it's terms of trade as they improve, will benefit Europe. So euro is already pricing the shock that you've had. But yes, that's a great question. Okay, so then what should we worry about? I'm going to do this very quickly so we can do Q&A. What is there to worry about? It's not Europe collapsing. By the way, Europe collapsing is my favorite story. It's like Europe is collapsing every 5 years, and it never collapses. In fact, it always integrates further. It's not the Ukraine-Russia war. At least I don't think so, although I could be proven very massively incorrect, as I said, next 4 to 6 weeks. Very critical 4 to 6 weeks. And I don't think it's US-China tensions. What I think we should worry about, first and foremost, is a new type of a risk factor. And it's what I call Machiavellian America. This here is a national capability index. It's a very outdated way to measure geopolitical power. So don't look at this chart and think it's like objective. It's outdated. But what it shows, but it's good enough, okay? What it shows, according to one measure used by political scientists, the US is as powerful today as in 1885, which is very low. In 1885, America was just one of many countries. Now, I think this is outdated. It doesn't incorporate enough American technological prowess. But the point still stands. The US is one of many countries. And what's interesting to me about the Biden administration, unlike the Obama administration, unlike the Trump administration, what I think the Biden administration has gotten right is this. They finally get it. Nobody cares what you think. You can't just show up in a country and say, like, we're Americans, give us what we want. No, it's not going to work that way. Huawei being the best example. So, I think American policymakers have finally figured it out. But here's the risk to that. If America gets that they're no longer in charge, they won't have any hesitation to blow things up. And I think we've seen that. Now look, I'm not in the camp that thinks America provoked Russia into a war in Ukraine. Putin had to make that decision himself. Nobody held a gun to himself. But was America the guy at the end of the bar saying like, hey, that guy is talking shit about you. What are you going to do about that? That's what the US did with Russia. Nancy Pelosi was a missile to provoke China. Absolutely. Absolutely. America is trying to provoke China into a war over Taiwan. 100%. And why shouldn't it? It's a great geopolitical trap if we were to do that. Because you know what happens if China invades Taiwan? My map of Huawei looks completely different. Europe will side with the US. So the biggest threat over the next 5 years is that America has figured out, hey, if no one's listening to what we want us to do, then we're going to be mean. We're going to be Machiavellian. And I'm not criticizing the US. All is fair in love and war. US learned from the last 2 decades what? What did the last 2 decades teach America? Try to get your rivals into Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Try to get them into the same mess you got yourself. So this, to me, is something that a lot of people don't understand. But here in Latin America, I think you do. I don't think you need me to explain Machiavellian America to you. So let me move on. The second issue, not well covered, is Iraq. Ukraine did not lead to any loss of supply of oil, and won't, as I said. It was a mistake. Most investment banks wrote a bunch of research about how we're going to lose 1.5 million barrels. We didn't lose any of it. All right. Iraq, however, has 3.5 million barrels that transits through the port of Basra. And Basra will be a location for the Shia on Shia civil war if it were to happen. I'm very concerned about this. Political developments in Iraq are starting to look very bad. And the reason they're looking bad is because Iran and Saudi Arabia are basically fighting a proxy war through Iraq and their allies in Iraq. This will cause a massive supply shock in oil. This will cause it. 3.5 million barrels literally go down one pier in Basra. You can go on Google Earth and look at it. One pier, 3.5 million barrels of oil. So this is, to me, the biggest risk right now, and we're all distracted by these other stories. And what I'm talking about specifically is that the Iranian-backed Shia militias, led by former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, are facing off against Muqtada al-Sadr. Muqtada al-Sadr is a nationalist, but he's also tacitly being supported by Saudi Arabia because he visits it every 6 months and gets a lot of money from it. So I'm concerned about what happens in Iraq over the next several years. Now, I can't predict when this happens. I just think this is the biggest risk from a macro perspective. And finally, the last piece of this that I want to say is that what I'm really concerned about is if I'm right about Ukraine, if I'm right about Russian politics, and if I'm right that Vladimir Putin is basically going to end up like Slobodan Milosevic. And if that happens, a lot of people around this room will be like, cool, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that Russia is a very, very large country. And it's a very large country with a lot of regional differences and minorities, and parts of Russia that are very critical to its energy production, like Tatarstan, that are not necessarily run by Russians. If Putin goes, my biggest concern is that we will be dealing with a warlordization of Russia for the rest of this decade. Now, it's not going to be like the whites versus the reds. It's not going to be like that obvious. It's not going to be a civil war, but it's going to be collapse of strong central state, which at the very least, for one of those OECD economic survey reports that always like is very sterile, at the very least it will create a negative investment environment for commodity production, at the very least. Now I'm going to leave you with this. This is my favorite painting. It's always been my favorite painting. It's a painting of Ivan the Terrible killing his own son in a fit of rage. It's medieval Russia. He didn't mean to do it. He did it. You know how it is. Anyways, Ivan the Terrible, Tsar Ivan, was the last, well actually his other son was the last of the Rurik dynasty. Romanovs came later, but not before what the Russians call the time of troubles, which is a very polite way to say a civil war that killed like a fifth of the population. So Russia goes through these periods when there is a dynastic change of, as I said, warlordization. And this was a particularly nasty one. But they've had it in the 20th century, they had it in the 19th century, they have it repeatedly. And I think the Ukraine war is kind of like 9/11. You know, in 2001, most people in the geopolitical, political community thought the US and China would be at each other's throats. Do you remember the first geopolitical crisis of 2001? Do you remember what it was? Does anybody know what was the first crisis before 9/11 happened? It was the Hainan Island incident where an American spy plane had to land on Chinese Hainan Island because a fighter jet from Chinese Air Force hit it. It was the first incident, and everybody was like, here it comes, here it comes. China, US, that's going to dominate the 2000s. It didn't, because of 9/11. America became obsessed with the Middle East and wasted basically 15 years running around, dudes running around Toyota trucks with machine guns. This could be the exact same situation. Everybody thinks China, US is going to dominate this century. I really don't. I think China has peaked as a global power, and I think the US obsesses about something that was last decade's issue. The number one risk this decade could be the dissolution of Russia. And the reason it matters to you in these countries here is because it will put pressure on inflation. It will put pressure, especially given the green technology agenda. A lot of those metals have to come out of somewhere, including Russia. Now, obviously, you know, you're sitting here, and on one side, as a member of a central banking institution, you're worrying about inflation. You're saying, Marko, that's going to be challenging. On the other hand, as a Latin American, you're saying like, yes, here comes that commodity super cycle, you know, and I do think that that's where we're headed. So I'm going to stop there and open up for Q&A if we have time. I think we do.
Yeah, we have 45 minutes.
Oh, okay. I was actually good.
Yeah.
Yes. Usually I'm not. I'm very bad. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marko, for that.
I'm going to, by the way, sorry, I'm going to remove this because I know it's a very, very harrowing image, which is why it's such a great painting. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So one thing I think I've noticed around the Ukraine conflict is the use of sanctions, right? So let's say the dollar has been kind of weaponized in this. The dollar has been weaponized in this conflict, and as you stated, it's not been applied completely because it wasn't enforced for oil in particular. So there's been also kind of a question, and this is mine, how important is the pricing of oil for the US dollar?
I think it's very important, you know, but it's very important from the perspective of the, you know, petrodollars. So there's three pillars of the American reserve currency, in my view. The three pillars are, first and foremost, American military hegemony, which still kind of exists. The second is liquidity of the American bond market, which is absolute. And the third is the fact that there's consumers of American treasuries that are price insensitive. What does this mean? The country with the worst net international investment position in the world is basically the United States of America. And yet, did you know that America makes money off of its net international investment position? This is the most geopolitical chart in the world. The American net international investment position is deeply negative but they're making money off of that deeply negative position. Why? Because Americans own high-yielding assets abroad, whereas all of you keep buying trash, right? And the number one buyer of that trash, other than China, is the Middle East. So I think that what's happening right now with Saudi Arabia and the US is the most relevant. So it's not necessarily the direct purchases of oil in dollars that matters. I think what matters is what you do with the proceeds of those purchases. Does your reserve management go and buy some treasuries with it or not? And if Saudi Arabia decides to stop doing that, I do think that will actually break one of the three pillars of American reserve currency. Now, reserve currencies don't go quickly. Barry Eichengreen, Professor Eichengreen, I'm sure most of you have read his work. He's a good friend of mine, and he is really, really smart on this stuff. He's written a lot of work on how reserve currencies lose their reserve currency status. It happens over decades. I don't think it will happen overnight. The British pound, as an example, it took really a long time. You know, it was really long time. And I think the same will be with the US. I think that we will have a more multipolar currency regime as well. And by the way, I think we're already there. But who gains the most in this regime? Let's just think about it for a second. What currency will gain the most? And I think it's obvious. It's the euro. Nobody else has the liquidity, and nobody else has the stability. You're not going to own renminbi. Why? Because what are you going to do with it? Can you take it out of the country? Not yet. I mean, the Chinese are moving towards that, but I think the euro has about 10% in terms of FX reserves. It can gain about 10%. And by the way, if you look at the long-term chart of FX reserves, euro's 10% below global levels of the 1980s. In the 1980s, if you aggregated all of the European currencies and created a virtual euro, they were about 10% higher in terms of FX reserves. So yes, I do think that's what matters. It's what do you do with the proceeds of oil sales?
Marko, one thing that I wanted to, listening to your talk, I think one of the things, in a room full of reserve managers, in an area that's very much dollar-based, as you said, we're also, you mentioned that who is pricing sensitive to our treasuries? Most of the people in this room are. Yeah. So they're forced to buy treasuries because of their reserve policies and so forth. And an overarching question that, given the war in Ukraine, and one of the things that we talked about within ourselves was basically the sanctions on the Russian central bank, and whether or not that was one of the factors that would probably lead into a multipolar world on the currency side, because you're basically forcing the creation of a parallel system to SWIFT and so forth. It hasn't panned out that way yet, but do you think that that's something that could be a reflection of this war?
Well, again, we need an alternative. China is not providing us with an alternative. Chinese capital account is not fully open. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do if you buy Chinese bonds? This is you're going to own a lot of renminbi. What do you buy with that renminbi? So it becomes a problem. Your pie chart of potential FX reserves, your pie chart is still limited by liquidity issues in other countries. They don't have enough liquidity, and by the fact that there's not enough open economies. So, as I said, the only alternative really is the euro at this point. And I think the liquidity is an issue for the euro. There's not enough euro bonds, quote unquote, I'm making quotes out of that, unless you want to own BTPs. So that's your only basically availability out there, which is fine. Like, I would own them, honestly. Like, the ECB already told you what they're going to do with BTPs. Europe has yield curve control. It has official yield curve control because the ECB is controlling the price level of BTPs. But the issue is that there isn't enough alternative assets to the treasury available yet. But I do think the Chinese are moving towards that direction. It's just going to take them a lot longer than I think most people thought.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things, when you mentioned the pound losing its reserve status to the dollar,
yeah.
it took a while for the dollar to be an alternative to the pound, more than for the pound.
Yeah.
And I think we are in in a way, we're in that situation now where it seems like the dollar has peaked as a global reserve currency, but you still don't have an alternative. And I agree with you that a few years ago, people would be certain that the euro was going to be one of them. But I think, and China is making that push into doing that.
But I would say corporate world has already started to use the euro. So if you look at the issuance in the global corporate debt market, the euro has been on the ascendancy. So what I would say is that the euro is not, I think it is an alternative, but it is, there's still not enough liquidity. Like I think for you to start converting proceeds from commodities into euro bonds, it's just, there's not enough.
Yeah, I think, my personal opinion is that what the euro needs is a common bond market, as opposed to having...
Yes, exactly. And the good news is the COVID kind of pushed them in that direction.
And we have somebody from people from Europe here that can talk a little bit more about that. But this is one of the things that, if you compare the euro to the US dollar is a fiscal union to a certain degree.
So look, I agree. COVID did push Europe into finally issuing euro bonds, which, I think Europe is a fiscal union. They just use the bond market as a transmission mechanism for it. And so what I mean by that is that everybody gets to borrow at much reduced rates and then spend money. But I agree with you, it's not perfect. It's not perfect, and obviously it's not going to replace the dollar. I just think on the margin, it can kind of reduce dollar's use.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to separate FX reserve management, which we can measure. We can have pie charts of every of your central banks, and we can look at what you're doing, and reserve currency, trade currency. Those are two different things. And I think that the US bond market continued to be a FX reserve management tool of choice because of liquidity issues and because of other issues. But trade can be conducted less and less in dollars. Those two things could happen at the same time. And I think that's where we're headed, effectively.
Okay.
Thank you, Marco. Could you please elaborate a little bit further the outlook of China in the global economy for the next 5 years after the Communist Party meeting, especially the role of China financing Latin American and African projects? You mentioned that households are highly leveraged, so the odds of continued growth in China are less for the next 5 years. But still, China has one of the largest saving to GDP ratio, so it is going to be crucial for world financing. So how do you see that and the impact on commodity prices, capital flows to the region?
Great question, and thank you for that. There's a lot of questions in there, so we're going to talk about China for a while now. First of all, my firm has an office in Shanghai, and my second in command is actually Chinese from Sichuan who runs our office there. So we produce a lot of research on China, and it's very, very critical, I think, to have a ground game in China to understand what's going on. So first of all, let's unpack a lot of the things that you asked. The first is what's going to happen to the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese investment abroad. I don't have the chart here, but I can show it to you. It's collapsed already. So Chinese investments abroad have already collapsed. And American obsession with the Belt and Road Initiative has also collapsed. The chart on the right is simply Google search, how much are people obsessing about this. By the way, I think some of the worst and most idiotic research produced by think tanks has been done on the Belt and Road Initiative. Yes, go ahead. Did you have?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentation. I have a...
Well, I'm not finished answering the China question.
Sorry? Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, but the point is the following, yeah. One element that is absent from your presentation is demographics. So I would like to know if you think that this is a relevant trend, especially when you think about Europe and China. They are getting older very fast.
I was going to bring that up to answer the other question. Yeah, so it's all part of the same story. So I'm going to use the demographics to answer the other question as well. So first and foremost, the Belt and Road Initiative was always just an attempt to export capital and excess capacity. There's so much talk about Belt and Road being geopolitically strategic. And it's like, sure, it is. The Chinese are not stupid. They're not going to invest in countries that don't matter to them. But the primary focus of Belt and Road Initiative was to export excess capacity built up over this debt binge over the last decade, which is exactly what Japanese did in the 1990s as well. They had their own initiatives over that period of time as well. Now, in the West, we perceived as these loans as somehow nefarious, you know? And so the Americans and the Europeans were shaking their fist at little countries like, don't take Chinese loans, you know, they're mean to you. And it's like, why are they mean to us? And I come at this from a Serbian perspective. You know, China invested a lot in Serbia, built railroads in Serbia, and Serbia can always default on those loans. What are the Chinese going to do? Come and invade us? No. So who's the idiot, right? Why'd you finance a bunch of people in Europe's Afghanistan? We will literally default on your bonds and take the railroad. My point is that China was not really getting some sort of a geopolitical master plan here. It was just exporting excess capacity. And my expectation is that it will continue to be basically over. This trend is, in my view, pretty much over. The Belt and Road Initiative is done. Now, your point about savings rate and your point about demographics are connected. What happens with societies, with states whose demographics goes down? Their household savings rate falls as well. Household savings is a function of demographics. Old people don't save, they consume. And so we saw this with Japan. As Japan aged, its savings rate fell. Now, why is that important? It's important because your current account is basically made up of savings minus investment. That's it. Anything that you don't save, if you invest above your savings, what do you need to do? You need to import capital or cut the investment. Now, Japan cut the investment. So if you look at investment as percent of Japanese GDP, it went from high 20s to basically single digits from the 1970s to 2000. Japan cut its investment as percent of GDP as it aged. But that's because Japan had other sources of growth, plus it became extremely wealthy, so Japan doesn't even need to grow. Its demographics are negative, GDP per capita in Japan goes up, no matter what they do. China did not reach the level of growth of Japan. China is not as wealthy as Japan, so China, in my view, is not going to have the luxury of reducing investment as percent of GDP as it ages. In other words, I guarantee to you, and I've written a lot on this, and this is very important for geopolitics, I guarantee to you that China will flirt, if not date, a current account deficit over the next 3 to 5 years. Now remember, in 2018, China almost entered a current account deficit. In 2018, China was almost in a current account deficit. What saved China is COVID. COVID saved China's balance of payments. How? What's the number one source of Chinese capital outflows? Does anybody know? It's the number one source of capital outflow out of China. Tourism. Well done, Arnab. Tourism was cut off, plus the number one source of inflows is exports, which surged because we were all buying Chinese goods on Amazon.com. As COVID goes down, as COVID dissipates, Chinese tourism will start again, and Chinese exports should re-normalize. So current account deficit will become an issue for China because of demographics and because of a high level of investment domestically to maintain a high level of growth. Why is current account important? It's important because that's a sword of Damocles the rest of the world will continue to have on China. Not only is China addicted to exports, but if China has a current account deficit and invades Taiwan, what is the world going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to stop financing China's current account deficit. They will enter a classic emerging market balance of payment crisis like that. And they'll have to have a deep recession. We all know what happens. Balance of payment crisis. Your imports have to collapse in order to balance your current account. So this becomes a geopolitical constraint on China. Demographics combined with the fact that investment has to remain elevated even as savings rate comes down. Now, Xi Jinping, Congress, what does that mean? It's very clear to me what China's doing. And by the way, it's not that different from what America's doing. What China's doing is it's recalibrating its policy towards redistribution of wealth. So China is going to try to boost labor's share of the economy and reduce capital's share of the economy. That's it. That's what China is doing. That is the #1 policy of Xi Jinping and the cabinet he's put into place. That's what common prosperity agenda is about. Now, for a lot of investors, that means China's not investable, right? So as I said, I speak to a lot of long-term investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and they're usually public institutions like yourselves. For a lot of the CIOs in these public institutions, China has become investable because of reputational risk. You know, if like Globe and Mail or Sydney Herald finds out that the CIO of a sovereign wealth fund in a Western country invested in some company, they've got a reputational risk. The second issue that they have is that they don't have clarity on where China's going in terms of, you know, its commitment to capitalism. All I would say about China is that it's doing exactly what everyone else is doing, just from top down. And they're focusing on reducing capital's share of the economy, like corporate share of the economy. This is going to be a permanent headwind for private enterprises in China. Now, does that mean you can't invest in China? I disagree. You can. You just have to do what you've done in the past. You have to know where policy is going in China, where politicians want there to be tailwinds, and invest accordingly. Chinese policymakers were obsessed with the digital economy, with the platform economy, with the TMT sector over the past decade. Where did Xi Jinping meet Obama? Does anybody remember in 2012? Where did he meet him? In California, in Silicon Valley. That's where they met. So there was a push to develop China's digital economy. Now there's a push to develop something else. What is that something else? It's semiconductor space, defense, and it's green technology. Green technology and alternative energy. Those are the sectors that in China will do very well, and a lot of the privately run sectors are going to do less well. But I don't think that this is some sort of a phase shift in China, and the performance of Chinese equities reflects, again, hysteria. Like this idiotic argument that Europe is going to deindustrialize. There's now this idea that China is becoming Maoist again. You know, first of all, I have no idea what Maoism is. If someone can explain to me how this is something different, I have no idea. China is simply focusing on redistribution of income. Now, what's interesting to me about this is why they're doing this. Why is China focusing on redistribution of wealth? I think there's a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I think they've become very pessimistic about their own ability to escape the middle income trap. So this was something that they were obsessed about. A lot of work was done by academics in China focusing on the middle income trap. They're becoming less and less optimistic about their ability to escape it. The second issue, and so by the way, if you can't escape the middle income trap, you better redistribute wealth or else you get political risk. I think the second issue is that January 6th, what happened in the US really had an impact on Chinese policymakers. When, you know, you had basically the storming of American capital, I had more questions from Chinese counterparts than I ever had in my life. They were obsessed about January 6th, which is interesting because in America, it was both like a mix of horror and comedy. Like Americans, there was like a mix, like, oh, it's terrible, but also kind of hilarious because the guy has like horns and it's weird and blah, blah, blah. The point is, in China, it wasn't at all funny to them. To them, January 6th was like, oh my God, if this can happen in America, it can happen in China. And by the way, if it happens in China, we're mowing them down with machine guns, just to be clear. Like, this isn't like, you know, that's what happens in China. So Chinese policymakers, after that moment, realized three things. One, income inequality is a huge political risk. It's a risk in America and a risk in China. China and America are much closer than US and Europe or China and Europe on this issue. China and America, on many measures of income inequality, distribution of income, meritocracy, are very much similar. The second thing that Chinese policymakers realized is that the TMT sector, tech, needs to be regulated. Because if a bunch of Americans can believe conspiracy theory about pedophiliacs and aliens, literally, and then storm the Capitol because of that, so can in China. And so they've literally accelerated their policies towards this because of what happened in the US. So I think that what you will see over the next several years is more focus on income inequality and redistribution. The problem is that the number one way to do that, the easiest way to do that is what? It's real estate tax. If they institute a real estate tax though, the net present value of most savings of Chinese households is going to collapse. If they institute a real estate tax, all those moms and dads and grandmas and grandmothers who own 2, 3 condos, the value of that savings will come down as they have to pay taxes on empty condos. And so the biggest problem that China has is how do we raise the tax level, the tax base, without completely collapsing the real estate market? I don't have an answer to that question. I have no idea how they're going to resolve that.
Do you think that, you know, when you mentioned January 6th, one of the opinions that I have is that if you look at the Chinese leadership from the last 30 years or so, I think one of the main things that drove their decisions is basically they want to avoid another Tiananmen Square at all costs. Do you think that they saw January 6th like a version of that?
Oh yeah,
Yeah?
for sure. I think also one thing that happened in China is that they've stopped trying to be like America, you know? So for the longest time, China thought, look, the US is a model to follow. January 6th crushed that. So what are they trying to do now? They're trying to replicate Germany. The Beijing Stock Exchange, which is a new stock exchange, is a stock exchange focusing on what? It's focusing on medium and small companies with deep technological expertise in manufacturing. They're trying to promote a Mittelstand of China. That's the first. The second is they're trying to promote renter economy. You know, Germany has one of the lowest home ownership rates in the developed world. A lot of people rent and they're comfortable renting. China is trying to move the real estate market into more rent-friendly. And third, education. They're trying to create an education system that reflects Germany's. In particular, they want to stop having people go and get bachelors of arts in anthropology. Like they want to stop having too many people going to college. They want them to go to 2-year apprenticeship programs and like trade schools. So what we've noticed out of China is this complete reorientation of like the model that they're adopting. They're moving away from American laissez-faire, TMT sector, tech dominated, and they're moving into hard tech. And I would argue that they're doing the right thing. Tech domination, software, SaaS businesses, that's the last decade. We're coming to the end, in my view, of a tech-driven era. Everything lasts about a decade. You know, every theme, every investment thesis lasts for about a decade. In a world of higher inflation, in a world of supply, of inefficient supply of commodities, of real goods, of infrastructure, what's going to benefit are going to be atoms, industrials, like sectors that actually produce trains, planes, and automobiles. So I think China's move away from the tech sector and from the TMT sector makes a lot of sense. It's almost like they're getting ahead of the tech carnage, which is funny because they did it in 2021, right? They took a gun, they pointed at their kneecap, and they blew it. In 2021, China went after their own TMT sector. They said, okay, no more computer games, no more like platform economy, and we were all laughing at them like stupid Chinese, ha 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 ha. And then January 4th comes around, 2022, the 10-year starts going up, and what happens to the NASDAQ? It gets crushed. The Chinese did to their own market what our market did to itself. And I think that's because they have correctly assessed that this decade is not a decade of tech. This is going to be a decade of industrials and commodities. And I truly believe that. Like again, when I said that you need to invest as if it's 2002, what worked in 2002? Not tech. There's reasons for this. It was a capex-driven cycle where you needed copper, Caterpillar, iron ore, and so on. And I think we have another one of those cycles. So I think that not just did they see that as a Tiananmen Square, I think they also saw January 6th as the end of their model, their entire economic growth model, and it's pivoted from the US to Germany.
I saw recently some talk about NOPEC, kind of an opposition to the OPEC and its capacity for the oil market. Where do you think that is going? And kind of a more general question is, do you expect like this deglobalization to mean that inflation will be higher in going forward?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's because of NOPEC. I think it's because, so inflation will be persistently higher because of the things I said at the beginning. So San Francisco Fed has some nice models for you all to read. You probably have already read them, but San Francisco Fed has a paper on acyclical versus cyclical contributors to inflation. It also has a model that looks at supply and demand-driven contributors to inflation. And if you look at those models, what's very clear to me is that we're not in a demand-driven inflationary environment. Politically, it's nice to make fun of Biden and say it's his fault because of stimulus, but look, guys, we're gonna have inflation if we decide China's evil. 5 years ago, China was fine, now China's evil. Well, you're gonna have problems if you do that because it's kind of the middle of the manufacturing system. So the number one reason we have, well, not the number one reason, but one of the reasons is that we've decided to recreate supply chains because we want to. Not because they're inefficient, but because China's now evil. Number one. Number two is the ESG green agenda. We've decided to turn off the tap to fossil fuels. We've decided climate change is going to kill us in 5 years. In 5 years, it's going to kill us all. So we need to stop financing fossil fuels. Okay, did we turn off the demand tap? No, we're still driving fossil fuel cars. So the second reason there's this persistent supply problem is we don't have enough supply of fossil fuels, not because of OPEC or cuts or anything like that. Look at the capex going into mining and oil exploration. It's collapsed. It's the first time that higher prices have not incentivized capex. So we need to change that as well. And then the final piece of the supply puzzle is multipolarity and this obsession with redundancy. So Spain has a 2 billion euro plan to build semiconductors. Spain. Forget about America and the CHIPS Act. Every country in the world now wants to build semiconductors, because we're all obsessed. Oh my God, we need By the way, here's my fearless prediction. 5 years from now, when we're all back here, the coasters will be 7-nanometer chips. It'll be a novelty item. We'll have such an oversupply of advanced chips, they'll be worthless, by the way, as a consequence of this. So in the short term, though, in the long term, it might be deflationary. In the short term, all of this is clearly inflationary. And it's all because of political decisions that China's evil, climate change will kill us, and so on. And so what does this mean for central bankers? It means that raising interest rates to deal with inflation will guarantee produce more inflation. So I know a lot of you are trying to douse yourself with gasoline, light yourself on fire. I can see some people are taking things to throw at me. Yes, I have a PhD from the Recep Erdogan University, right? I get it. Just hear me out.
Marco, we are all long treasuries, so...
Yeah. So yeah, exactly.
If yields start coming down, we're happy.
Okay, let me explain what I mean by this. I think the biggest myth, let me go back a little. The biggest myth in our epistemic community, the biggest myth is that Paul Volcker is Jesus Christ and Burns is the fallen angel from the heavens, Satan. Burns did exactly what Volcker did. But the 73-75 recession that Burns created delayed the supply response, delayed North Sea oil exploration coming online, delayed the political response. Who won the election in 1976? Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Right? Why did Jimmy Carter win in 76? Because of the 73-75 recession. What do you think is going to happen in the United States of America in 2024 if Jay Powell gets us to 2% inflation next year? What do you think is going to happen? We're going to get Paul Ryan? We're going to get a supply-side reformer in 2024? The answer is hell no. Absolutely no way. We're going to get more populism. What I'm getting at is this. You cannot believe that the difference between Burns and Volcker is 600 basis points. Really? Is that simple? Burns just didn't raise rates enough? No. It's not that simple. Burns had a macroeconomic context that required supply to be unleashed, and the 73-75 recession delayed the supply side response. No one's going to invest in capex during a recession. And American people, the median voter, was not ready for pain, so they elected a populist who did price controls. So, if you raise rates and you create a recession, in the middle of a supply-driven inflationary dynamic, you're going to delay their supply response. And you will probably create a political dynamic that will double us down on populist policies. Now, does Jay Powell agree with me? I don't know. We'll see in the next couple of months. I mean, I think he probably does secretly agree with me. I think Lila Brainard has already given us crumbs of a pivot. She said in a speech 2 weeks ago, what did she say? We need to reflect on the impact on the real economy that our interest rate policy has done. But I will guarantee you something, okay? Let's say I'm wrong. Let's say that Jay Powell is a monetarist jihadi. Let's say that he wants to be Volcker, right? Let's say that I'm wrong and that's what happens. Then I will give you a prediction. I will predict to you that there is no way we will be below 3% CPI in the US in a non-recessionary quarter for the rest of this decade. If we have a deep recession produced by interest rate hikes over the next 12 to 18 months, we will not be out of the current inflationary environment for the rest of this decade. I'll show up here 5 years from now, I'll eat my 50-page chart pack if I'm wrong. I will eat it with some like nice Colombian sauces on the side. There's no way, because the reasons we have inflation have something to do with demand, but you're not going to dampen demand and then let supply catch up. No. What do you think it's going to do to supply? How are we going to pivot out of China? How are we going to develop green technology? People are going to invest in green technology when unemployment in America is at 6%? Are you crazy? What's going to happen to CapEx? It's going to go to zero. CapEx is going to go to zero. We're not going to do a single thing we need to do to overcome our supply issues. So, visit the San Francisco Fed website, read some of their papers, look at some of their modeling. It's simple. You can do this yourself. Supply side drivers of this inflationary wave are huge. And unless we all decide to play nice with China, unless we decide that climate change is maybe not that important in the next 10 years, maybe we can deal with it later, let's burn some coal. Unless we decide, which we're not going to do that, by the way. We're not going to play nice with China. We're not going to burn more coal. What we're going to do is we're going to stick to the political agenda that we have, but that political agenda has to be satisfied with investment and more supply. And that's why Erdogan is right. He's just not right about Turkey. Turkey doesn't need more supply. Turkey needs less demand, but the world needs more supply. Okay, I'm now open for you guys to throw all sorts of things at me and yell at me and be mean to me. Yes? Arnab.
Yeah. I'm going to leave this whole Erdogan thing aside. It's just too destabilizing.
Too destabilizing.
I just, taking a step back and listening to everything you say and going back to some of your slides, right? The one about American capabilities and the one about Huawei. I wonder if it's that cut and dried, right? In the Huawei slide, there are a lot of countries in gray that have not banned Huawei, but that I think you said were unlikely to adopt Huawei in their 5G programs. So I wonder if it's not more, that story is not more on America's side than maybe you said. And then sort of following on from that, in this whole discussion, it sounds like you're saying China has peaked, there are a lot of constraints, and I agree with a lot of those. So I just wonder if I don't disagree that it's a multipolar world. I just wonder if it's not the case that the Americans are still holding pretty much all the cards, and that even if it's not a completely unipolar world, it's primus inter pares, right, or by quite a lot, and that they will still determine what happens, and that the dollar will still dominate, not just because treasuries are liquid, but because the U.S. is in such a strong position militarily. That's what's being shown in Ukraine, and because the economy is, although it has all these issues, it is still way out there in front of the rest.
Well, as I said, I don't think the currency is going to stop being a reserve currency anytime soon. I also think the dollar has peaked. So in other words, yeah. So like, you don't need to have a negative view on US as a current currency reserve to be short dollar. Dollar has had bear markets that had nothing to do with its currency. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you look at this map, about 80% of population is just not with the US on this issue. Now, India is actually gray here, so it's about 60. But if you look at Ukrainian sanctions, it's the same chart. 80% of population on the planet has not put any sanctions on Russia. And there's anecdotals that are really stark when it comes to this. For example, the Biden administration negotiated a really expensive F-35 deal with UAE. And the Biden administration, when it came in, they said, listen, you can keep the F-35 deal, but we need to add a provision into this deal that you ban Huawei for 5G in the United Arab Emirates. And then you can get the F-35s. What did Abu Dhabi do? They said, no thanks, we'll just buy French Rafales. You know? And so what I think it shows is that the US is still definitely the most powerful country in the world. It's just it's less relevant that they are from a perspective of trade and global flows. That's it. They cannot compel countries to end trade. And in fact, like the reason countries in Europe are not going to use 5G but didn't ban it is because they just don't want to irk China. You know? Whereas during the Cold War, this wasn't a question, like irk the Soviet Union. No, you're not going to trade with Soviet Union. Until the 80s, when the Europeans started to diversify. And in fact, one of the reasons you have pipelines from Soviet Union, Russia, to Europe is because Europeans didn't listen to Americans even in the 80s. The Ronald Reagan administration was absolutely livid that Europeans kept building these pipelines. But I think that this environment is clearly one where, yes, US is first amongst equals, but it just means less in today's environment. And you will have more and more countries like UAE skirting US rules. And I always use that UAE example because the United Arab Emirates is a country that literally cannot defend itself. It's a country that does not have the capacity to defend its borders. So the fact that they so gallantly told Americans to take a hike, we don't need F-35s, we'll buy French Rafales, was, I think, notable. Saudi Arabia is another one, which is starting to diversify its defense portfolio, if you will. You know, so UAE bought the French Rafales instead of F-35s. Saudi Arabia is going to start diversifying its defense portfolio as well. And so, you know, oftentimes when I speak to investors, they say, Marko, you must be long defense stocks. It's like, well, okay, fine, yes, but you have to think about how that's going to develop over the next decade. And what I often tell them is you need to be buying non-US defense stock. French, Turkish, Indian, those are the countries that are going to increase their TAM, their tangible accessible market, the total accessible market, whereas US TAM of their defense companies will go down as countries seek to diversify themselves. The other thing is that, you know, the original question that you asked was, are these sanctions going to erode the dollar? I don't think so, but they might erode the willingness of countries to be so closely interrelated with the US. Because one of the most interesting things that happened was not that the White House tried to seize reserves. What I thought was most interesting about Russia was how quickly the private sector and social media actually abandoned and canceled Russia. And I think a lot of other countries are watching that and saying, I need to diversify everything I do, whether it's FX reserve management, whether it's defense companies I buy, whether it's tech. So I don't want to be stuck in any one camp. In other words, multipolarity will do exact opposite of what Cold War did. Cold War forced countries to choose sides and stick to that side. The multipolar environment is creating an environment that incentivizes diversification of everything. And so what I tell, you know, when I go around and I give talks, I call it geopolitical promiscuity. The countries that will succeed in the next decade are those that will be geopolitically promiscuous. You know, they're going to play the field. They're going to have Tinder apps, geopolitically speaking. No, they didn't land here? This is a tough crowd. You got it.
No, that's good. That's good.
That was good?
That was good.
I don't know. Like, it was a tough crowd. But look, my point is that I think countries that choose one or the other camp are going to be limiting themselves and are not going to profit in this environment. So non-alignment makes sense. And that's where India, by the way, comes in. You know, Indian policymakers, Modi's administration has been very clear, and that's why I'm really looking forward to the next panel, because we have a lot of representation of the West, and then you guys did bring someone from India. And I'm sure that the point of view of India is going to be, we're gonna do what's right in our interests. The Indian foreign minister was recently at an event in Bratislava and was pushed on this issue of Russian sanctions. Why haven't you chosen a side? Why are you sitting on the fence, was the accusation. And he said, I'm not sitting on the fence, I'm standing on my interests. So I'm not gonna choose a camp. It's not in my interest to do that. And I think that many other countries are going to realize that's very beneficial going forward.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
I think.
May I have one last question, please?
Yeah.
All right. First of all, thank you for the discussion. You mentioned Powell and the hold that he has on markets, but on the political side, we've had tremendous polarization in U.S. politics and generally in the country. You can sense that, and we've gone from Obama to Trump to Biden, and we've seen some very significant changes in policy from Obama to Trump. Maybe not so much from Trump to Biden in some respects, on others, yes. But what is your outlook on the political front in the U.S., given all of these changes that we've been witnessing over the past couple of decades?
I mean, that's another hour conversation, right? We don't have an hour. Here's what I would say. I have 3 degrees in political science. 3, which means 2 things. First, I'm an expert at flipping burgers, okay? So political science, you know. But the one thing that's scientific about political science, the one thing is that if there's a recession, the incumbents are going to lose. That's a fact. Biden, whoever, doesn't matter. They could run a cute chocolate Labrador, they would lose. And that's really important, by the way, because Donald Trump is still a very, very powerful figure. He has 30% of the base of the Republican Party. And the way the Republican primaries work, you can win a lot of delegates with a plurality of votes in the Republican primary. So if Donald Trump faces another Nash equilibrium of candidates, a plethora of candidates, he is the leading candidate. And if there's a recession, he is the likely candidate to win. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that's kind of a petty issue. You know, Trump comes back, it is what it is. The world will adjust accordingly. But what is problematic for me in the US is this. There are long-term polls in the US, long-term polls, going back to the 80s and 70s, that gauge what demographic factors predict one's view on the world. So for 40 years, Pew Research has been asking people a set of non-political questions that have to do with their worldview. And then they would correlate it with different factors, age, race, gender, education, religion, party affiliation. And for most of US history, most of the time that we have the data, predicting one's values, one's essence as a human being was difficult. It was difficult to predict who Americans are based on the variables you had at your disposal. You would meet someone, okay, like education, gender, all that. I don't really know who you are. I need to speak to you. Over the last 10 years, the sole predictor and a powerful predictor is party affiliation. To the point that Democrats and Republicans are no longer party affiliations. They're ethnicities. So Democrats and Republicans are Croats and Serbs, according to this. They're Hutus and Tutsis. It's evolved from this, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, whatever, to the only demographic marker that matters. And there's a lot of anecdotals now. There's a lot of articles out there how people no longer want to date a Democrat or Republican. They no longer want to, like once you find out, oh no, she's a Republican, I'm out. This is very, very scary to me. So all I would say to you is that there's a petty way to answer your question. Petty way is like, who wins the next election? What does that mean? The more profound point is that if we have a deep recession in the United States of America, let me tell you something. I am happy I have that Canadian passport. I'm getting into my SUV in LA. It's 27 hours to the border, right? I can get there in about 30 hours. I'm from Serbia. I've seen it all before. I've seen the language, the verbiage, the tensions, and I know how to get myself to the border. All right, that's it. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thank you.